You hear it first in the hush of late night. A man, once draped in silk and spotlights, standing tall at the center of catwalks, now stands accused of horrors so grave they unravel every thread of his empire. The name is Peter Nygård, a Canadian fashion tycoon once celebrated for democratizing affordable women's clothing and hosting decadent parties in his Bahamian estate. Yet, behind the sequins and champagne glasses, survivors whisper a darker reality. Decades of alleged coercion, abuse, and manipulation. Courts in Canada have since moved past the word alleged in some cases, convicting him of 4 counts of sexual assault, sentencing him to 11 years in prison in 2024. Other charges still linger in Montreal, Winnipeg, and even across the border in the United States. You are here tonight because this story isn't just about a man. It is about how unchecked power can wrap itself in glamour until the world stops looking too closely. Welcome to 102 Hours. You lean back, headphones on, and I greet you softly. Thank you for spending your evening with me. As always, I'll guide you through history's darker corners in a calm, careful voice. If you enjoy this kind of story, don't forget to gently tap like and subscribe, so you'll never miss our next midnight exploration. And if you're listening right now, drop your city and your local time in the comments, because it's always fascinating to see where and when we're all gathered together. Tonight, we trace how a glittering empire of fabric and fame concealed allegations of abuse for decades, until the seams finally ripped apart. Nygård's rise wasn't sudden. Born in Finland in 1941, he moved with his family to the cold streets of Winnipeg as a child, part of that post-war wave of immigrants reshaping Canada. You imagine him then, a young boy with little money, navigating the prairie winters, watching his parents work hard in factories. By the late 1960s, he carved out a business selling women's apparel, a market often overlooked by big-name designers chasing Paris and Milan. His company, Nygård International, soon expanded across North America. Department stores, catalogs, TV shopping channels, all carrying his name in bold, sleek letters. Yet here's the odd tidbit. Despite building a billion-dollar brand, Nygård himself was notorious for micromanagement, reportedly approving even the smallest clothing samples personally, like a king inspecting his coins. Investigators still question whether that obsession with control in fabric also bled into how he handled people's lives. By the 1980s, his reputation as a playboy began to swirl. Long gray mane, he open silk shirts, and a parade of young women at his side. Magazines praised his vitality. But behind those glossy covers, some women claimed they were trapped in a world where the line between invitation and coercion blurred dangerously. The first real cracks in his empire showed up in whispers. Former employees recalled bizarre rules at his corporate offices. Women allegedly pressured to dress in certain ways, late-night meetings that sounded more like auditions for his personal life. In 2010, his Bahamian neighbor, none other than hedge fund billionaire Louis Bacon, fueled a public feud, accusing Nygård of everything from environmental damage to hosting sex-fueled parties. At the time, many dismissed the feud as a clash of egos between 2 rich men. Yet some survivors say that feud accidentally helped shine a spotlight on what was happening behind those silk curtains. The mansion itself, nicknamed Nygård K, became infamous. Imagine a sprawling Mayan-inspired palace perched right on a private slice of Bahamian beach. Waterfalls, glass elevators, mirrored ceilings, even a disco floor. It looked like something straight from a James Bond villain's daydream. But to those who've since testified, it was less paradise and more gilded cage. They say young women, sometimes minors, were flown in, lured with promises of modeling careers or parties. It is here, survivors insist, that much of the abuse took place. For decades, little stuck legally, until 2020. That year, the FBI and New York police raided his offices. It wasn't whispers anymore. It was international news. A federal indictment accused him of racketeering, sex trafficking, and using his wealth to recruit and silence victims. Across Canada, police finally moved forward on long-dormant cases. The spell had broken. Peter Nygård wasn't untouchable anymore. But tonight, as you listen, remember, this story isn't only about a disgraced mogul. It's about how victims often face impossible odds speaking against powerful men, and how institutions can look away until public pressure makes silence impossible. The empire glittered, yes, but the darkness was always stitched in. You picture the frozen prairies of Manitoba in the 1950s, where a boy named Peter Nygård carried groceries down narrow streets, his family fresh off the boat from Finland. Immigrant life wasn't glamorous. His parents worked factory jobs, scraping together every penny. Yet young Peter developed a fascination with appearances. How clothes could project confidence, hide poverty, or signal ambition. In the land of practical wool coats and flannel shirts, he saw fashion as a ticket out of obscurity. By the late 1960s, you're walking beside him into a small building in Winnipeg's garment district. He's not yet the mogul with the yacht and Bahamian estate. He's a hustling salesman with sharp elbows and sharper instincts. He buys into a failing women's apparel line called Jacob Fashions. Within months, he rebrands it as Nygård International, stamping his own name on every label. And here's the quirky twist. While high fashion was chasing Parisian couture, Nygård decided to democratize style. Affordable, mass-produced women's separates, pantsuits, blouses, skirts that promised department store shoppers they too could look chic. The gamble paid off. You flip through old catalog pages and see smiling models in polyester suits, bright and bold for suburban mothers and office workers alike. By the 1970s, Nygård products filled racks across Canada. By the 1980s, his reach extended to the US, where QVC and other shopping channels broadcast his smooth sales pitches directly into living rooms. He wasn't Yves Saint Laurent or Calvin Klein. He was the king of middle-market glamour, a man who turned polyester into profit. Investigators still question whether this obsession with putting his name on everything, from store signage to personal jets, was about branding or about ego. Because while his business thrived, Nygård himself carefully cultivated an image. Long flowing hair, sun-kissed skin, always in silk. He became both mascot and mogul, selling not just clothes but a lifestyle of eternal virility. And Winnipeg? The city that had once been a backdrop of hardship became his testing ground for loyalty. Employees remember long hours, relentless demands, and a culture of control. A peculiar tidbit floats up here. His headquarters had a mural of himself, larger than life, painted in heroic style. It was less a workplace, more a shrine. For a man who came from nothing, he seemed determined to remind everyone, including himself, that he had conquered obscurity. But power doesn't stay quiet. By the 1990s, whispers of troubling behavior trailed him even as his stores expanded. The runway success was real. His brand generated hundreds of millions in sales annually. Yet, behind the scenes, lawsuits alleging harassment began to flicker like warning lights on a dashboard. Some were settled quietly, tucked away behind non-disclosure agreements. You lean into the microphone's hush now and remind yourself. In 2024, a Canadian court convicted him of 4 counts of sexual assault. That legal outcome stands. But when you rewind to the 1970s and 80s, it looked like nothing could touch him. He was Winnipeg's golden son, proof that immigrant grit could turn polyester into power. And yet, as you've seen in so many cases, success often builds the fortress that hides the shadows. Behind those racks of affordable blouses and skirts, another story waited. It would take decades for the seams to unravel. Close your eyes, and you hear the surf crashing softly against Bahamian shores. A warm breeze moves through palms, carrying scents of salt and jasmine. On the horizon sits something surreal. Nygård Kai, the private estate Peter Nygård built on Nassau's Lyford Quay. To the public, it was paradise incarnate, an architectural fever dream of Mayan pyramids, mirrored ceilings, waterfalls, and marble floors that glowed under colored lights. Yet, to those who lived through it, survivors say it was less Eden, more gilded cage. Imagine a palace sprawling across several acres, complete with a 100,000-square-foot compound, beachfront pavilions, even a faux volcano that could belch fire during parties. Guests often described it as if Hugh Hefner had merged with a Bond villain and been handed unlimited credit. Celebrity photos prove this wasn't fantasy. In the 1990s and 2000s, stars mingled here, athletes, politicians, models, all sipping cocktails under tiki torches. For many visitors, it was simply excess at its peak. But for some young women, drawn by promises of modeling contracts or work, it became a place they'd later describe with words like trap, nightmare, and abuse. Here is a quirky tidbit. The estate had a glass-floored disco where fish swam beneath dancers' feet. Guests marveled at it, calling it whimsical. Investigators still question whether those whimsical distractions were deliberate, designed to dazzle outsiders so they wouldn't to look closer at the house rules whispered by staff. Some employees later recalled that women visiting the estate were often carefully managed, guided to certain rooms, told what to wear. The power dynamics were stark. Nygård was the emperor of this tropical kingdom, striding around in silk shirts, his long gray mane catching the light of fire pits. He entertained ministers and moguls, using the estate as both playground and stage. Local Bahamians sometimes saw the parties from afar, boats anchored offshore to glimpse fireworks bursting above the quay. But those same locals whispered suspicions. Too many young women flying in and out. Too many rumors about passports locked away, flights canceled. In 2010, the illusion began to fray when neighbor Louis Bacon, a hedge fund billionaire, launched a feud. He accused Nygård of hosting wild sex-fueled parties and illegally expanding his property into protected lands. The dispute turned bitter. Court battles, public mudslinging, private investigators. What once seemed like eccentric neighbor drama began drawing reporters who sniffed out deeper claims of abuse. The quay, once marketed as a tourist attraction in glossy brochures, became ground zero for international headlines about sex trafficking allegations. For victims, stepping forward was terrifying. Imagine testifying against a man who owned private jets, who could summon celebrities as character witnesses, who built his own fortress in paradise. Yet some did. Their accounts painted the quay not as a luxury retreat, but as a machine, where women were allegedly recruited, flown in, then controlled. The very features that made the estate a wonder, its gates, its remoteness, its endless parties, were, to survivors, evidence of isolation and manipulation. Even when the FBI raid in 2020 finally cracked open the story, aerial shots of the quay still showed glittering pools, torchlit gardens, and pyramids rising like something eternal. But behind that glitter, survivors insist, lives were scarred. So you sit in the quiet now, picturing it. Paradise shimmering under moonlight, yet haunted by echoes that luxury could never silence. The quay wasn't just a mansion. It was a symbol of how wealth and spectacle can disguise exploitation, until the walls themselves start to whisper. You're standing in a boardroom now, not a palace, and the lighting is fluorescent rather than torchlit. Still, the mood carries the same unease. This is where the whispers began to gather momentum. Inside the walls of Nygård International, where assistants, designers, and models started murmuring about what they'd seen. On the surface, it was a booming fashion empire producing affordable clothes for millions. But behind those silk curtains, employees quietly swapped stories of manipulation, odd rules, and behaviors that made them question the man who signed their paychecks. One former employee recalled how Nygård demanded loyalty bordering on worship. His offices weren't ordinary cubicles. They were decorated with giant portraits of himself, sometimes in heroic poses, as though the company was less a business and more a temple. Here ends the quirky tidbit. Staff described a command center room where dozens of surveillance cameras fed into screens, allowing him to watch over the estate and offices alike. It sounded futuristic at the time, but to workers, it reinforced an atmosphere of constant control. Investigators still question whether this surveillance was just about security, or about monitoring people in ways that blurred ethical lines. The whispers weren't only about cameras or murals. Models said they were pressured into late-night meetings that had little to do with fashion sketches. Some staff noticed a steady rotation of young women visiting the offices, introduced as interns or guests, who often seemed nervous. In the beginning, those who spoke up were ignored, dismissed, or quietly let go. After all, this was the 1980s and 1990s, when powerful men in glamorous industries often moved unchecked. By the 2000s, lawsuits began to surface. Some women alleged harassment, others described coercion. Several of these cases were quietly settled out of court, sealed with non-disclosure agreements that kept the details hidden. Yet for insiders, the pattern became impossible to ignore. One case here, another there, each sounding eerily similar. You imagine the unease of walking into work every day, knowing that the empire's fabric was fraying, but stitched together by money, intimidation, and silence. And then came the neighborhood feud with Louis Bacon. It began over noise, lights, and property boundaries, but it unearthed something far more sinister. Suddenly, whispers from staff and models were amplified by private investigators, affidavits, and journalists willing to listen. Those rumors, once exchanged over whispered phone calls or hushed coffee breaks, spilled into the public record. Survivors who had felt isolated began realizing they weren't alone. Still, the culture of silence held strong. Many feared retaliation. Some worried about being blacklisted from modeling or design careers if they spoke against a mogul. And in the background, the empire marched on. Runway shows, glossy catalogs, smiling spokesmodels selling polyester blouses on shopping networks. For the outside world, Nygård was still the charismatic king of affordable fashion. For insiders, he was the reason whispers never seemed to stop. It's easy, years later, to say the signs were obvious. But you remind yourself, hindsight is a bright light. In the moment, everything was dimly lit. For decades, those whispers fluttered like moths around a chandelier. Ignored, fragile, but impossible to completely silence. You hear it before you see it. The thud of boots on polished marble floors, the snap of gloves being pulled tight, the hushed voices of agents calling clear. It is December 2020, and the FBI, alongside New York police, raids Peter Nygård's Manhattan headquarters. For decades, whispers and lawsuits had swirled, but now federal agents are moving in with search warrants and sealed indictments. The empire built on polyester and glitz is about to collapse in a very public way. The timing wasn't random. Earlier that year, dozens of women had filed a massive class-action lawsuit accusing Nygård of sex trafficking and racketeering, with some allegations stretching back to 1977. Investigators still question whether the scale of the operation, if proven, was comparable to a commercial business model, deliberately recruiting, grooming, and silencing victims to maintain power. Suddenly, what had once been gossip columns and civil disputes was upgraded to the serious realm of criminal law. Imagine standing outside that New York office tower. The company logo still glimmers above the revolving doors, but now cameras swarm as agents carry out boxes of documents, computers, hard drives. For years, Nygård's lawyers had beaten back allegations with settlements and delays. But a federal raid? That's something money can't instantly make vanish. Here's a quirky detail. The New York headquarters included a floor modeled after his Bahamian estate, Mayan statues, tropical motifs, a little slice of paradise transplanted into Midtown Manhattan. To guests, it was eccentric and bold. To agents, it looked like evidence of a man obsessed with image, carrying his fantasy world wherever he went. Within days of the raid, Nygård was arrested in Canada at the request of U.S. authorities. The charges were staggering: sex trafficking, racketeering, transportation of minors, conspiracy. Prosecutors alleged he used his wealth and fashion empire to lure women, offering modeling opportunities that often ended in abuse. While he denied wrongdoing, the machinery of justice now moved faster than his empire could shield him. For survivors, the moment was bittersweet. Many had waited years for accountability, speaking into voids that rarely answered back. Now they saw helicopters circling his offices, their stories suddenly validated by the sheer weight of law enforcement. And yet, justice is slow. Legal teams began wrangling over extradition to the U.S., while Canadian prosecutors announced charges of their own. The man who once strode down catwalks to applause now shuffled into courtrooms in handcuffs. Investigators still question whether authorities could have acted sooner, if earlier warnings and lawsuits should have triggered this kind of intervention years, even decades before. But in that December moment, one thing was clear: the FBI had come knocking, and the silk curtains shielding Peter Nygård's empire had finally been ripped aside. You're back in Toronto now, the chill of late autumn seeping into courthouse steps. Reporters jostle for position, their breath fogging the air as cameras click. It is October 2021. And Toronto police announced charges against Peter Nygård, multiple counts of sexual assault and forcible confinement, stretching across 2 decades from the mid-1980s to the mid-2000s. For years, whispers had traveled from runways to boardrooms, from the Bahamas to New York. But this moment feels different. This is his home country, finally acknowledging what survivors had been saying all along. Standing at the press conference, investigators detail how the charges were laid after months of reviewing historical complaints. Survivors describe events dating back to when they were as young as 16. Some incidents allegedly took place in Nygård's Toronto headquarters, others at private residences. What had once been buried under glossy catalogs and TV shopping channels was now spelled out in police language: assault, confinement, trauma. You sense the reporters scribbling furiously, each pen stroke marking a small step toward accountability. Here is the quirky detail. Nygård's Toronto offices were located in a massive warehouse-style building that employees nicknamed the Castle. It had mirrored glass windows, stark angular lines, and inside, a layout that some described as confusing, almost maze-like. Investigators still question whether that environment contributed to an atmosphere where control and secrecy thrived. Survivors later testified that even the office spaces sometimes became arenas of coercion, blurring the line between professional and predatory. Back in Winnipeg, police were conducting their own investigation. In Montreal, too, additional complaints began surfacing. Canada, which once celebrated Nygård as a rags-to-riches immigrant success story, now watched its image of him disintegrate in real time. National headlines splashed his mugshot across front pages, a stark contrast to the grinning tycoon who once posed in silk shirts and gold chains. And yet, you notice how carefully authorities phrased everything. These were charges, not convictions. Nygård, through his lawyers, denied the allegations and promised to fight them in court. Even so, the symbolism was profound. Canadian law, often criticized for moving too slowly on powerful men, was finally catching up. For survivors, this was both validation and dread. Validation, because the legal system had finally acknowledged their pain. Dread, because facing cross-examination in open court meant reliving traumas many had spent years trying to bury. Some came forward publicly, others chose anonymity. But together, their stories created a chorus too loud to dismiss. Investigators still question whether earlier Canadian authorities missed opportunities. Why complaints filed years ago were shelved or ignored? Would victims have been spared if action had been taken in the 1990s? That question lingers like smoke, even as the charges move forward. and so you stand on those courthouse steps in October air, surrounded by the hum of cameras and murmurs of bystanders. Canada, a nation that once cheered Peter Nygård's business success, now leans in to hear a very different story, one told not in fashion catalogs but in courtroom indictments. The oak-paneled courtroom is hushed, except for the shuffle of papers and the occasional creak of benches. You're seated quietly, taking in the scene as Peter Nygård, once the flamboyant mogul of polyester empires, sits in a defendant S chair, dressed in plain clothes, hair tied back, nothing like the larger-than-life persona he once projected. The charges are heavy, multiple counts of sexual assault dating back decades. What unfolds in front of you is not just a trial, but a battle between memory, trauma, wealth, and power. Survivors take the stand, one after another. Their voices waver, but the content of their testimony is unwavering. They describe encounters in offices, apartments, and behind locked doors. They speak of coercion disguised as opportunity, and of a man who, they say, believed himself untouchable. Each account is different, yet the patterns sound hauntingly familiar. You can feel the jury listening, some faces tightening, others staring at the floor as the gravity of the story sinks in. Here's a quirky tidbit. During recesses, reporters noted that Nygård often sketched designs on scraps of paper, as though clinging to the identity of a fashion king even in the middle of trial. To some observers, it looked like denial. To others, a desperate attempt to stay tethered to the empire slipping away outside those walls. The defense team pushes back hard. They remind jurors of the presumption of innocence, question inconsistencies, and argue that memories of decades-old events can be unreliable. They emphasize that some civil suits were settled quietly years ago, suggesting motives of money or fame. Investigators still question whether jurors can ever fully separate sympathy for survivors from the strict standard of proof required in criminal law. The prosecution, however, leans on patterns. When multiple people, unknown to each other, describe similar methods of grooming, similar settings, similar words, it paints a picture that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. They argue that Nygård's wealth and influence were not just incidental but instrumental in enabling abuse. His private jets, his secluded properties, his powerful lawyers, all, they say, formed a system that kept victims silent. As the trial stretches on, you notice how exhausting it is for survivors to relive their experiences under cross-examination. Some cry, some pause for long moments, searching for composure, but they continue. For them, this is not just about convicting one man. It's about reclaiming voices long suppressed. The jury watches every detail: the pauses, the trembling hands, the tearful glances. Meanwhile, the public outside the courthouse debates fiercely. Some recall shopping for Nygård's clothes in suburban malls, stunned that the brand they associated with everyday fashion is now connected with such dark allegations. Others, particularly activists and women's rights groups, argue that this case is a symbol, proof of how industries often shield powerful men until survivors force society to listen. Investigators still question whether Nygård's trial will shift how Canada treats historical sexual assault cases, especially when involving public figures. Will it set precedent, or will it be remembered as an exception? That uncertainty lingers as both sides deliver closing arguments, their voices echoing off courtroom walls. You sit in the hush that follows, knowing the jury must now deliberate. Outside, the world waits. Inside, the walls carry the weight of stories that took decades to finally reach a courtroom's ears. The courtroom is packed, and you can almost feel the air tighten as the clerk rises to read the jury's decision. After weeks of testimony, after days of deliberation, the words land like heavy stones. Guilty on 4 counts of sexual assault. Peter Nygård, once draped in silk and surrounded by cameras flashing admiration, now sits motionless as the weight of those syllables crashes over him. The jury has spoken, and the glittering empire he built is stripped away in a single verdict. You picture the scene in November 2023, when news outlets across Canada broke the story. Anchors who once described him as a fashion mogul now used words like convicted sex offender. Survivors sat in the gallery, some clasping hands, some crying softly, others staring straight ahead, their expressions unreadable. For them, this was both an ending and a beginning. Justice had taken decades to arrive, and though it did not erase what had happened, it validated their voices in the most official way possible. Here's the quirky detail. As the verdict was read, observers noted that Nygård briefly closed his eyes, almost as if retreating inward, before opening them with the same stoic expression he'd worn throughout trial. Some speculated he was calculating appeals, others thought he was simply stunned. Investigators still question whether he ever truly believed this day would come. After all, for so many years, lawsuits dissolved in settlements, whispers disappeared into silence, and power seemed like an impenetrable shield. The guilty verdict was more than a personal reckoning. It was a cultural one. In Canada, where he had been celebrated as a rags-to-riches immigrant success story, the conviction forced a painful reflection. How had so many ignored the rumors? How had a man who built his brand on empowering women through fashion been allowed to operate unchecked for so long? The irony was impossible to miss. Garments designed to give women confidence were tied to a company whose founder now stood convicted of violating that very dignity. Outside the courthouse, cameras captured survivors stepping into the chilly air. Some declined to speak. Others gave short, firm statements about reclaiming their voices and urging other victims of abuse to come forward. In those moments, the narrative shifted away from Nygård himself to the courage of those who testified. And yet, even as the verdict echoed, the story wasn't finished. Legal teams began preparing appeals. Other charges in Winnipeg and Montreal still hung unresolved. U.S. prosecutors were still pressing for extradition. The conviction was monumental, but it was also one battle in a war that stretched across borders and decades. Investigators still question whether the verdict will lead to broader accountability, not just for Nygård, but for industries that allowed his power to flourish unchecked. Will companies rethink who they celebrate? Will institutions learn to listen when whispers first begin? Those questions remain unsettled. But on that day in November 2023, inside that Toronto courtroom, the whispers had turned into testimony, testimony into conviction, and conviction into a historic moment. You imagine the silence after the verdict, solemn, heavy, yet strangely hopeful. For survivors, it was proof that even empires built on glamour can collapse when truth is finally heard. You sit in the hushed courtroom as the judge begins to speak, every word deliberate, every pause carrying a gravity that settles into your chest. The sentence is read: 11 years in prison. For Peter Nygård, who once strutted through life draped in luxury fabrics and camera flashes, the next chapter will be measured not in fashion shows or corporate deals, but in prison meals, locked doors, and the long shadow of shame. The date is January 2025. And Canada watches with rapt attention. This isn't just a sentencing, it's the symbolic end of an era. You imagine Nygård, now in his 80s, standing frail yet defiant, as if still trying to summon the image of the mogul he once was. But time and truth have stripped away the illusion. He's no longer the host of glittering parties or the architect of a Bahamian palace. He's an inmate-to-be, and the law has the final say. Here's a quirky detail that filters through coverage. Nygård reportedly wore a plain gray suit, its fabric dull and unremarkable, a stark contrast to the flamboyant animal prints and silk shirts he favored during his reign. For a man who once styled himself as untouchable, the simplicity of that suit told its own story. Investigators still question whether he grasped, in that moment, the full meaning of what had been taken from him. Not just freedom, but identity, status, and the empire built on abuse. The survivors spoke at sentencing, their voices carrying more weight than any designer brand could ever muster. One described years of silence, broken only when she realized others were ready to speak too. Another said she no longer saw herself as a victim, but as someone who had forced accountability where power once reigned. The court gave them the platform, and they used it not just to confront Nygård, but to reclaim their own stories. Beyond the courtroom, ripple effects spread. The Canadian fashion industry, which once toasted him as a homegrown success, began a reckoning. How had so many ignored the patterns? How had wealth and glamour blinded institutions to the mounting evidence? Media retrospectives replayed clips of Nygård's lavish parties, juxtaposing the laughter and champagne with the grim reality of his crimes. It was a national lesson in the dangers of unchecked celebrity and corporate culture. Historically, Canada has wrestled with public figures who fall from grace, but this case felt different. It wasn't a scandal of finances or politics. It was about human dignity, stolen over decades. The sentence underscored that no empire, no matter how dazzling, can outshine the persistence of survivors and the pursuit of justice. Inside prison walls, life would be stark. 11 years is not a symbolic number. It's a practical one, marking birthdays, seasons, and the inevitable decline of age. For Nygård, already an old man, it may represent the remainder of his life. Investigators still question whether he will face additional time if Winnipeg and Montreal cases proceed, or if U.S. extradition one day follows. For you, listening in this quiet hour, the image is clear. A man who built an empire on bright lights and whispered shadows now faces the long, dim monotony of incarceration. 11 years. A sentence heavy enough to signal justice, yet never heavy enough to erase the harm done. Still, it stands as a warning that even the most powerful can be brought low when truth refuses to stay buried. You lean back, exhaling slowly, as the courtroom chapter in Toronto closes. But even after the guilty verdict and the 11-year sentence, you realize the story of Peter Nygård isn't neatly tied with a bow. Instead, it splinters into unfinished cases and unanswered questions that stretch across Canada and beyond. In Montreal, prosecutors still hold files on allegations from the 1980s and 1990s. Women have come forward with accounts that echo the patterns exposed in Toronto. Lavish invitations, promises of opportunity, and nights that ended in violation. Yet those charges have not yet reached trial. Some survivors fear the delays will outlast their stamina. Others hope the momentum of the Toronto conviction will push the wheels of justice faster. But court systems, as you know, rarely move at the pace of public outrage. Farther west, Winnipeg carries its own shadows. This is where Nygård grew up after emigrating from Finland as a boy, and where his empire first began. It's also where some of the earliest allegations surfaced. There's a painful irony here. The city that once celebrated him with murals and philanthropy may one day host a trial that cements his disgrace. Investigators still question whether those Manitoba charges will ever reach a jury, given his age and the practical limits of the justice system. And then there's the United States. You recall that in 2020, FBI agents raided his New York offices. Federal prosecutors accused him of running a cross-border sex trafficking ring, allegations that sounded ripped from a nightmare but were detailed in chilling indictments. Yet, as of now, the extradition process remains stalled. Canadian authorities chose to prioritize local survivors and trials first. Whether he will ever stand before an American jury is a question without a clear answer. Here's a quirky tidbit you might not expect. Even as his legal troubles stacked up, small groups of supporters appeared outside courthouses, insisting he was misunderstood or targeted unfairly. Some wore vintage Nygård clothing as if to make a statement. The contrast between those die-hard loyalists and the survivors who testified could not have been sharper. Meanwhile, survivors live with the complexity of justice half delivered. For some, the Toronto conviction was enough. It validated years of silence. For others, unfinished cases represent unfinished healing. Until every allegation has been heard, closure remains elusive. It's a reminder that legal victories do not always align neatly with personal ones. Historically, Canada has seen long, drawn-out processes in cases involving powerful men, trials delayed by appeals, health issues, or jurisdictional squabbles. You can sense the same dynamic here. 11 years behind bars feels like a final chapter, yet dangling threads suggest otherwise. Investigators still question whether Nygård A.'s empire shielded him for so long that full accountability may never be possible. With each passing year, memories fade, witnesses grow older, and the machinery of justice grinds slower. But the record stands. Guilty on 4 counts, sentenced to prison, with unresolved charges waiting in the wings. For you, the listener, the atmosphere is one of suspended tension. The glittering empire has already crumbled, but the echoes linger in courtrooms not yet called to order. It's as if the story breathes on, unfinished, daring us to keep watching, to keep asking whether power can ever fully answer to truth. You picture the scene outside a courthouse, microphones angled toward trembling hands, voices quivering but steadying as words spill into the cold air. Survivors of Peter Nygård, once silenced by contracts, fear, or disbelief, now stand shoulder to shoulder, their stories finally heard. For decades, whispers circulated about parties in the Bahamas, late-night modeling calls, and the blurred line between glamour and coercion. But whispers alone never brought justice. It was testimony, raw, public, undeniable, that transformed shadows into light. One woman describes the first time she realized she wasn't alone, how a newspaper article mirrored her own private nightmare. Another speaks of reclaiming her identity, no longer a victim, but a survivor whose courage chipped away at a billionaire's fortress. You can almost feel the relief threaded through the pain. Investigators still question whether earlier accountability, years earlier, might have spared others. But what is certain is that once a few voices broke the silence, many more followed, amplifying each other until institutions could no longer ignore them. Here, Au has the quirky detail. Some survivors deliberately chose to wear everyday clothing rather than formal attire when speaking publicly. They explained that their goal was not spectacle but truth, not a performance but a reckoning. The ordinariness was a kind of power. It said, "This could happen to anyone, and we are still here." Historically, movements against powerful predators often hinge on the bravery of the first few who speak. You recall Anita Hill in the 1990s, or the waves of testimony during the Immaculate Me Too era. Nygård's survivors are part of that lineage, showing that courage can echo across generations and reshape cultural norms. Their voices are not just personal, they are political, cultural, historical. Some survivors found strength in solidarity, forming networks to support one another emotionally and legally. Others chose privacy, declining interviews but offering testimony in court. Both paths mattered. Both chipped away at the culture of silence that allowed abuse to fester unchecked. And yet, healing is not linear. For some, testifying opened old wounds. For others, it provided closure. You sense the fragile balance, the need to move forward while acknowledging scars that may never fully fade. Investigators still question whether the legal victories will translate into long-term healing, but what can't be doubted is the resilience on display. For you, listening in the quiet of night, the message is simple but profound. When voices unite, even empires tremble. Survivors have shifted the narrative from glamour and excess to accountability and resilience. Their stories remind you that justice isn't only a courtroom verdict. It is the act of speaking, of being heard, of refusing to vanish into silence again. You settle deeper into your chair, and the story now feels less like a courtroom drama and more like a cultural postmortem. The empire of Peter Nygård, once glittering with sequins and stitched with ambition, is remembered not for its fashion lines or glossy catalogs but for the darkness hidden beneath. His name, once plastered across malls and billboards, now lingers in headlines tied to words like abuse, conviction, prison, That is his true legacy, a warning disguised as a fashion empire. You trace the arc. A boy from Finland grows up in Winnipeg, claws his way into business and builds a global brand that dressed women across North America. But woven through the seams of that success were patterns of exploitation, allegations whispered in green rooms, suspicions buried in NDAs, victims dismissed by those who saw only profit. Investigators still question whether the industry turned a blind eye for too long, complicit in protecting its golden mogul. Here's the quirky fact. At its peak, Nygård International reportedly employed over 12,000 people worldwide. Yet by 2020, the company was in bankruptcy. Its stores shuttered, its employees scattered. What had once been marketed as a family-style empire collapsed almost overnight, leaving empty storefronts as eerie reminders of how quickly power can vanish when truth surfaces. Historically, societies love tales of rise and fall. From kings toppled to tycoons ruined, the narrative warns that unchecked power rarely ends well. Nygård's story fits neatly into that lineage, but with a uniquely modern sting. The glitz of celebrity culture, the global reach of fast fashion, and the belated roar of survivors finding their voices. His empire shows us not just the corruption of one man, but the vulnerability of entire systems to charm, money, and denial. For survivors, his legacy is not measured in court verdicts alone, but in the courage to stand visible. For the fashion industry, it's a reminder to examine who is celebrated, who is protected, and who is left unheard. And for you, listening in this still hour, it's an unsettling lesson. Beauty and power can sometimes hide the ugliest truths. The empire built on abuse is gone, but its echoes remain. Whether institutions change or history repeats itself will depend on whether those echoes are ignored or amplified. You've followed a long, heavy journey tonight, from the rise of a boy chasing dreams to the collapse of an empire stitched together with threads of harm. You've heard the voices of survivors, the sharp gavel of the courtroom, and the slow unraveling of a myth. And now, as the night deepens, you let those echoes settle into something quieter. There is no glamour in this ending, no triumphant runway, no glittering lights. Instead, there's reflection. Reflection on how justice, though imperfect, can arrive even after decades of silence. Reflection on how voices, when joined, can topple the illusion of invincibility. And reflection on how industries and societies must learn to listen earlier, to question harder, to protect better. You breathe slowly. The story of Peter Nygård reminds you that darkness can lurk beneath polished surfaces, but it also reminds you of resilience, the human ability to speak, to resist, to reclaim. Survivors of his empire have not only confronted him in court, but also reshaped the legacy he leaves behind. They have made sure his name will not be remembered for fashion shows or beachside mansions, but for accountability and warning. So tonight, as you close your eyes, let the weight of the tale drift away. You are safe in your own quiet space. The empire of abuse has fallen, but your thoughts, your breath, and your dreams belong only to you.